What if the bomb that just went off inside an Iranian mountain was designed for exactly one purpose, to make sure nothing buried underneath that rock would ever survive? And what if the country that built that mountain fortress spent 40 years betting that no weapon like this would ever exist? Before we go 1 second further, hit that like button right now. Tap subscribe and send this video to one person who still thinks this war is winding down. Because after today, you will know something they don't. Look at the footage. A plume of fire punches out of a hillside near Isfahan, and it does not stop after the first flash. It keeps burning, keeps rolling, keeps finding new gaps in the rock to escape through. That is not a normal explosion. A normal bomb hits something, blows up, and it's over in a second. This one behaves like it's alive, like it's chewing through the inside of that mountain from a direction nobody expected. And once you understand what actually caused that, the rest of this war starts to make a lot more sense. What you're looking at is the result of a weapon called the GBU-57, a 5,000-pound precision-guided bomb that the Pentagon has started using again and again against Iran's underground missile network. This is not a small story about one strike on one night. This is a story about how the United States finally built a weapon that solves a problem Iran spent 4 decades preparing for, and about what happens to a country's entire war strategy when the ground itself stops, being able to protect it. Let's start with the basics, because understanding this weapon is the key to understanding everything else happening in this war right now. For years, Iran built its missile program the smart way. Instead of keeping missiles sitting out in the open, where a single fighter jet could destroy dozens of them in one pass, Iran buried everything. Assembly lines, storage depots, launch equipment, all of it dug into mountain size across the country, wrapped in layers of rock and reinforced concrete thick enough that a normal bomb would just scratch the surface and leave the actual weapons inside completely untouched. This is a strategy other countries have used too. North Korea has done it for decades along its border. Hezbollah tried something similar in Lebanon before its own tunnels got found and hit. The logic is simple. If the enemy cannot see it and cannot reach it, the enemy cannot destroy it, no matter how many jets they send. For a long time, that logic actually worked in Iran's favor. Regular bombs could crater a runway or flatten a building, but they could not follow a missile down through 80 feet of solid rock. The only weapon that could reliably do that kind of damage was the GBU-57, a 30,000-pound monster so heavy that only the B-2 stealth bomber can carry it. And that weapon is not something you use casually. Sending a B-2 on a mission means flying it from the other side of the planet, coordinating an enormous support operation, and spending one of America's most sensitive and expensive aircraft on a single target. You do not scramble a B-2 every time intelligence spots a new tunnel entrance. There simply are not enough of them, and the cost of using one constantly would be enormous. That gap, the space between a normal bomb that can't touch a mountain fortress and a 30,000-pound monster you can only use sparingly, is exactly where Iran built its strategy. And it is exactly the gap the GBU-72 was built in. To close, the GBU-72 first entered testing back in 2021 and has been described by the Air Force as an advanced 5,000-pound penetrator. Picture it as the missing middle piece between the smaller 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs that came before it and the massive GBU-57. It is heavy enough and hard enough to punch through around 100 feet of earth and more than 20 feet of solid concrete before its fuse finally triggers. But unlike the GBU-57, it can be carried by aircraft that are already sitting in the region, ready to fly within the hour. The F-15E Strike Eagle, a fighter jet built to carry heavy loads and fight its way home if it needs to, can sling this weapon underneath its wings and be airborne fast. The B-1B bomber can carry it too. That means commanders no longer need to wait hours for a stealth bomber to cross an ocean. If intelligence confirms a target today, this weapon can be over the target within the same day. Think about what that actually means on the battlefield. Iran's entire underground strategy depended on time. Move the missile deep into the mountain, keep it hidden, and even if satellites eventually spot the facility, assume that any American response will take so long to arrive that the missiles can be moved, fired, or hidden again before the bomb ever lands. The GBU-72 collapses that window. Reports have already confirmed it was used against hardened coastal sites near the Strait of Hormuz, hitting facilities believed to house anti-ship and coastal defense cruise missiles that Iran had positioned to threaten shipping through the strait. General Dan Caney, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, confirmed publicly that these 5,000-pound penetrator weapons were dropped into underground storage sites holding exactly this kind of missile stockpile, describing the bombs as purpose-built to get through rock and concrete and still function once they are inside. There is something genuinely clever about how this weapon is engineered, and it is worth slowing down on for a second. A bunker buster cannot explode the moment it touches the ground, because if it did, all that destructive energy would go off on the surface and barely dent whatever is buried below. Instead, this bomb is built around a hardened steel casing that can survive smashing through soil and rock without breaking apart, paired with a fuse that waits, counting through the layers of material as the bomb tears through them, only detonating once it senses it has reached the depth it was aimed for. That is the entire secret. It is not about the size of the explosion. It is about making sure the explosion happens in exactly the right place, deep inside the target rather than on top of it. And the guidance system tells you just as much about how modern warfare actually works. This weapon can be steered purely by GPS coordinates programmed in before a jet even takes off, letting the crew release it and let it fly itself home. It can also be guided by laser with the crew tracking the target live as the bomb falls for extra precision. Here's the part that matters most. If that laser tracking gets interrupted, whether from smoke, cloud cover, or the crew having to maneuver because of a surface-to-air missile threat, the weapon does not simply lose its way and miss. It automatically falls back on the last confirmed GPS location and guides itself in from there. And that is not a minor technical detail. That is the difference between a weapon built by people who understand what an actual combat mission looks like and one that only works perfectly on a testing range with nothing shooting back. There's a longer history behind this weapon that is worth understanding because it explains why the Pentagon keeps reaching for this exact category of bomb whenever this war reaches a new phase. The idea of a precision earth-penetrating bomb goes back to the Gulf War when American commanders needed something that could reach deeply buried Iraqi command bunkers that nothing else in the arsenal could touch. Engineers rushed a weapon called the GBU-58 into service almost overnight, a laser-G-guided penetrator that became the direct ancestor of everything that followed. That same basics bloodline of weapons kept reappearing over the following decades. Used against hardened facilities tied to Hezbollah's leadership, now used repeatedly against Iran's own underground network. The GBU-57 is essentially the next generation of that same idea, rebuilt with modern GPS and inertial guidance. A tail kit for accuracy and a steel body engineered to survive punching through solid rock without breaking apart before it is supposed to. Every generation of this weapon exists for the same simple reason. Every time an adversary digs deeper to hide something, engineers eventually build something that can reach deeper. Still, that back and forth is basically the entire history of underground warfare compressed into one sentence. And right now, Iran is on the losing end of that particular arms race. It is also worth understanding why the F-15E specifically keeps showing up as the platform of choice for these strikes, because the reasoning tells you a lot about how modern military planning actually works behind the scenes. The Strike Eagle is a two-seat twin-engine fighter built to carry a heavy payload while still being able to fight its way in and out of contested airspace if something goes wrong. That makes it a natural aircraft to carry a 5,000-pound penetrator underneath its wings. But the deeper reason commanders favor it here is speed. If intelligence confirms a high-value underground target today, nobody wants to wait for a B-2 to fly nearly a full day from a distant base just to get a single weapon on target. If F-15 are already forward deployed in the region, and they are, commanders can send a small formation sitting less than an hour's flight from the target, strike with precision, and have those jets home before the sun comes up. That is the entire logic driving this phase of the war. Get in fast, hit exactly where the intelligence says the target sits, and get out before Iran's air defenses or leadership can even fully process what just happened. Now for a quick reality check before we continue, because if you have been watching this war unfold across headlines, you already know it does not move in a straight line, and staying honest about that is the whole reason this channel exists. This current wave of strikes did not come out of nowhere. Go back to the summer before last when American aircraft used the massive GBU-57 for the first time in combat, striking Fordo, Natanz and Isfahan in a single coordinated operation aimed squarely at Iran's nuclear program. That strike hit the headlines hard, and for a while it looked like it might be the beginning of the end. It wasn't. Fighting kept flaring, cooling, and flaring again over the following months. This past spring, tensions boiled over once more with both countries trading strikes across weeks of escalation. Eventually, after Washington threatened to hit Iranian infrastructure directly and gave Tehran a hard deadline, both sides accepted a shaky 2-week ceasefire that allowed a trickle of shipping traffic to resume through the Strait of Hormuz. That ceasefire held long enough for diplomats to hammer out something bigger. A memorandum of understanding signed with real ceremony at the Palace of Versailles this past June meant to formally end the war. It lasted less than a month. Iran kept threatening ships and interfering with traffic through the strait. Even after signing that agreement, apparently trying to force commercial vessels to follow routes and pay fees that Thrawn itself controlled. When a handful of ships were attacked in early July, President Trump declared the truce effectively dead. Strikes resumed, and within days, Trump announced something that surprised almost everyone, that the United States would reimpose its own naval blockade on Iranian ports. But with a twist nobody saw coming. Washington would charge a 20% fee on cargo shipped through the strait in exchange for guaranteeing safe passage, framing the entire arrangement as payment for 50 years of America protecting that waterway for free. Whatever you think of that idea, it tells you something important. The last concession Iran had actually managed to extract from months of painful negotiation evaporated in a single social media post. That is the world this new round of GBU-72 strikes is landing in. Not a war winding down toward a tidy peace deal, but a war that keeps circling back to the same unresolved question. Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz? And how far is either side willing to go to answer that question permanently? If you have made it this far, you clearly want more than headlines. So, do me a favor and drop a comment right now telling me which part of this war you think the media is getting most wrong. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. Let's talk about why this particular target. Iran's underground missile network around Isfahan matters so much more than a single explosion on a screen. This region sits near one of the largest missile assembly and storage complexes Iran has ever built. Constructed over roughly 4 decades specifically to survive the kind of bombing campaign it is facing right now. Satellite imagery from earlier construction phases shows exactly how patient this project was. Separate storage bays, dedicated access roads built purely to feed vehicles into tunnel entrances, and entrances themselves designed to look like nothing more than ordinary hillside terrain from a distance. The entire philosophy behind this kind of facility is to spread risk across dozens of entry points, so that even if one tunnel gets discovered and destroyed, missiles can still roll out of a different entrance, fire, and disappear back underground before any retaliation can find them. For a long time, that philosophy worked. Reports suggest this general area has already absorbed dozens of bunker buster strikes across this war from B-2s, from B-52s, from F-15 sorties. And yet accounts kept surfacing of missiles rising out of those same mountains again within days. That should tell you something. Damaging the entrance to a tunnel is not the same as destroying what's stored inside it. You have to reach the actual depth where the missiles are kept, not just the doorway leading to them. That is precisely the gap the GBU-72 exists to close, and it is precisely why the Pentagon keeps reaching for this specific weapon instead of declaring victory and moving on to other targets. Picture the scale of what Iran actually built here for a moment. Because the numbers involved are staggering once you sit with them. This is not one bunker or one storage shed. Analysts believe Iran's ballistic missile reserves alone could number somewhere in the range of 10 to 15,000. Weapons spread across facilities like this one nationwide. A stockpile built up specifically as leverage against exactly the kind of pressure it is facing right now. Building that kind of arsenal and the tunnels needed to protect it took decades of patient, deliberate investment, funneling enormous resources into infrastructure that was never meant to be seen, let alone found and destroyed. Every one of these strikes is chipping away at an investment that took a generation to build, and that is exactly why losing it hurts Iran's long-term strategic position in a way that goes far beyond the immediate damage of any single explosion. There's also a quieter danger hiding inside all of this, one that rarely gets discussed. If Iran understands that satellite imagery is what leads American targeting teams to these facilities, it has every incentive right now to start building convincing decoys, structures made to look exactly like real bunker complexes on overhead photos, hoping to bait a very expensive precision weapon into destroying an empty hole in the ground. That means the intelligence gathering behind these strikes matters just as much as the bomb itself. A 5,000-pound penetrator is only as good as the information that tells commanders exactly where to point it. And right now, both sides are locked in a quiet contest over who can outsmart the others, satellites and sensors. This is also where Iran's public rhetoric starts to make a lot more sense once you look past the surface. Statements coming out of Tehran right now tend to frame every one of these strikes as reckless, warning that continued escalation will force Iran into decisions the world has not seen from it before. That kind of language plays well domestically and gives the impression of strength to an audience that needs to believe its government still holds the upper hand. But listen closely to what is actually being defended in every one of these statements. It is almost always the missile program, specifically the one asset Iran has spent longer building and protecting than almost anything else in its arsenal. When a government keeps returning to defend the exact same target set in speech after speech that tells you where the real pressure is landing, No matter how confident the public statements sound, defiant words from a podium do not change. What satellite images keep showing happening underground? Mountain after mountain, tunnel after tunnel. Step back even further, and you can see a clear pattern in how this entire campaign has been sequenced from the start. Early strikes focused on radar systems and communication networks, effectively cutting off Iran's ability to see incoming threats or coordinate a fast response. After that came a wave of strikes against command and control facilities, severing the connection between decision makers and forces in the field. Now the focus has shifted specifically to missile production and storage, the actual physical muscle behind Iran's ability to retaliate or hold leverage at any future negotiating table. That is not a random or chaotic sequence that reads like a deliberate campaign designed to strip away options in the exact order that forces a decision, whether that decision comes from running out of stockpile, running out of leadership consensus, or simply running out of time. And this is where the real tension in this entire war actually lives underneath every headline about bombs and blockades. Iran wants two things badly: money to rebuild everything that keeps getting destroyed, and a way to keep its remaining ballistic missile stockpile out of whatever. Final agreement eventually gets signed. Iran understands perfectly well that Washington is drawing its hardest line around the nuclear program specifically, which means the missile stockpile has become the quieter, arguably more important fight happening in the background. If Iran is still sitting on thousands of ballistic missiles once a final deal gets signed, that stockpile functions like an insurance policy protecting everything else Tran cares about: its remaining nuclear ambitions, its drone program, and any future leverage over shipping through the strait. Strip that stockpile away piece by piece, mountain by mountain, and everything else Iran has. Spent decades building starts looking a lot more fragile. That is exactly why these specific strikes on Isfahan's underground network keep happening again and again, instead of the campaign simply winding down. Every tunnel that gets hit is not just a pile of rubble on the news. It is one less card Iran gets to hold at whatever negotiating table eventually reopens. Now, let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz itself, because the situation there tells you everything about how fragile this entire standoff really is. Iran's navy has repeatedly declared the strait closed to certain vessels, warning that ships attempting passage without following Throne's own rules would be targeted, and it has followed through on that threat more than once, using drones, fast attack boats, and reportedly naval mines to disrupt shipping traffic. But here's the part that matters. Despite all of that pressure, American and partner naval forces have kept working to keep commercial traffic moving, intercepting drones before they reach tankers and maintaining protected corridors through the strait. There is a meaningful difference between a country announcing a blockade and a country actually having the power to enforce one. And right now, the gap keeps showing up again and again in the water itself. Since the reimposed American blockade took effect this past July, the picture has become even more complicated. Instead of simply reopening the strait to free traffic, Washington is now positioning itself as something closer to a toll collector, charging a fee on cargo passing through in exchange for safety guarantees. Iran, understandably, sees this as yet another attempt by the United States to control a waterway that runs directly along its own coastline. That resentment is not going away quietly, and it is very likely part of why strikes on Iran's coastal missile sites, the exact places housing the weapons Iran would need to threaten that shipping in the first place, have become such a consistent target for the GBU-57. It helps to remember just how much weight this narrow stretch of water actually carries for the entire planet, not just for the two countries fighting over it. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil shipments pass through the Strait of Hormuz on any normal day. That single fact is why every blockade announcement, every drone intercepted near a tanker, and every toll proposal out of Washington sends a ripple through energy markets far beyond the Gulf itself. When traffic slows even slightly, insurance premiums on tankers spike almost immediately because underwriters have to price in the very real chance that a vessel could be struck. Energy markets react the same way, often before a single ship is actually stopped, simply because uncertainty itself has a cost. That is the entire point of a blockade announcement in the first place. It is designed to spook shippers and spike prices before anyone even needs to fire a shot. The problem for Iran is that this kind of pressure only works if the threat feels credible. And every day that hundreds of vessels keep moving safely through protected corridors, that credibility takes another quiet hit. If you're starting to see how all these pieces connect, the bomb, the blockade, the diplomacy, the tunnels, then you already understand this war better than most headlines will ever explain it to you. And that is exactly why hitting subscribe right now actually matters, because we're going to keep tracking every one of these threads as they develop. Let's talk honestly about the diplomatic chaos sitting on top of all of this, because it reveals something important about what is actually happening inside Iran's own leadership right now. The memorandum signed at Versailles. This June was treated at the time as a genuine breakthrough, a formal ceremony, real signatures, real hope that this brutal back and forth might finally be over. Less than a month later, it had completely unraveled when ships were struck in the strait. In early July, President Trump publicly declared the truce over, and within days, strikes on Iran resumed for several consecutive days in a row. What makes this moment different from earlier collapses in the ceasefire is how openly fractured Iran's own decision-making appears to be. Some elements within the Iranian government seem to want a genuine off-ramp, a way out from underneath a bombing campaign that keeps eating away at their most protected military assets one mountain at a time. Other elements seem unwilling to accept anything that looks like surrender, or may simply not have been fully looped in on how close previous negotiations actually got. When one part of a government appears to be quietly working toward a deal, while another part publicly denies anything was ever close to being signed, that is not the behavior of a unified leadership speaking with one voice. That is the sound of a government under enough sustained pressure that its internal seams are starting to show in public. Think about what it actually takes for a government to sign a formal memorandum at a location as symbolically loaded as the Palace of Versailles, then watch it collapse within weeks over a handful of ship attacks and one blockade announcement. That is not the pattern of a confident, unified state calmly managing a negotiation on its own terms. That is the pattern of a leadership structure trying to hold multiple competing pressures together at once. International expectation, domestic hardliners, military commanders watching their most protected assets disappear one mountain at a time and running out of room to satisfy all of them simultaneously. Every time a deal appears close and then falls apart, it is worth asking not just what changed on the battlefield, but who inside that government gained or lost influence in the days surrounding the collapse. And that fracture matters enormously for how this war ends. Because wars like this one rarely end with one dramatic signature and a clean handshake. They tend to end messily with strikes and negotiations running on parallel tracks. They frequently contradict each other, with different factions inside the same government pulling in completely different directions depending on who happens to be speaking on any given day. What we are watching right now, a devastating strike on an underground missile complex one week, talk of resumed negotiations the next, followed almost immediately by another. Round of tight for TAT attacks is exactly what that messy middle phase of a long war looks like from the outside. It does not necessarily mean the process toward peace is failing. It might just as easily mean the pressure has become real enough to split leadership into camps that genuinely disagree about how much more punishment their country can absorb before something has to give. So where does all of this actually leave us right now? You have a physical campaign that keeps accelerating with precision of bunker buster strikes, methodically dismantling the underground missile infrastructure Iran spent 40 years building specifically to survive this exact kind of war. You have a diplomatic track that keeps collapsing and reforming agreements signed with genuine ceremony one month and torn apart within weeks by a handful of drone strikes and a blockade announcement. And underneath both of those tracks, you have a simple, brutal contest over a single stretch of water that carries a fifth of the world's oil, with one side desperate to control it completely and the other side unwilling to give up the last card it has left to play. There's one more thread worth pulling on before we get to where this all leaves us, because it says something about where this kind of warfare is heading in the years ahead. Not just in this specific conflict, this war has already shown flashes of a future where drones, uncrewed vessels, and precision-guided munitions play an outsized role compared to older, blunter forms of combat. Intercepting drones before they reach a tanker using precision penetrators instead of massive area bombing, relying on satellite intelligence to pick exact points on a mountainside rather than flattening entire regions. All of it points toward a style of warfare that is more surgical, more information dependent, and in some ways more unforgiving of mistakes. A war fought this way rewards whichever side has better intelligence, faster decision-making, and weapons precise enough to make every strike count. Iran built its entire defense strategy around the assumptions of an older kind of war, when we're hiding things underground was usually enough. Watching that assumption get dismantled in real time is watching one era of military strategy quietly give way to another. None of that changes the fact that real decisions are still being made by real people under enormous pressure on both sides. Every strike carries risk of miscalculation. Every blockade and toll announcement carries the risk of pushing a fragile diplomatic track past the point where it can be repaired. And every day this drags on, ordinary people far from any battlefield keep paying the price through higher energy costs, disrupted shipping, and the constant background anxiety of not knowing whether tomorrow brings a real ceasefire or another round of strikes. It is easy to get caught up in the technical details of a bomb's penetration depth or a jet's flight time and forget that underneath all of it sits a very human question. How much more damage does either side believe it can absorb before the cost of continuing outweighs whatever it hoped to gain by holding out? The GBU-72 did not start this war, and it will not end it by itself either. But every time that bomb disappears into a mountainside and that chain reaction lights up the sky over Isfahan, it is quietly rewriting the terms of whatever deal eventually gets signed, because every mountain that gets emptied out is one less bargaining chip. Iran gets to walk into that negotiating room holding. That is the real story hiding behind every one of these explosions. Not just a weapon doing what it was built to do, but an entire country's decades-long strategy for surviving a war like this, getting dismantled piece by piece, tunnel by tunnel in front of the whole world. What we do know for certain is this. The mountains around Isfahan are quieter than they were 40 years ago. Not because Iran stopped building, but because the tools built to find and destroy what it built have finally caught up. That single shift, a weapon closing a gap that once felt permanent, is the real headline sitting underneath every clip of fire pouring out of a hillside. And it is the reason this specific war keeps refusing to end the way anyone originally expected. I want to hear where you think this actually goes from here. Do you think Iran's leadership eventually unifies around a real deal? Or do you think these strikes keep escalating until something far bigger breaks loose? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely read every single one and this audience has called things right more times than most of the networks covering this war ever have. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening, instead of just reacting to another headline, share it with someone who needs to see it too. And I will see you in the next